The only military that can shut down the Strait of Hormuz is not Iran's. It is not Russia's forward-deployed naval assets. It is not even China's People's Liberation Army Navy operating in the region. The force that could close the world's most critical energy choke point in a matter of hours is the United States Navy itself. And if you think that sounds impossible, stay with me, because what I am about to show you is not speculation. It is operational doctrine that has been sitting in Pentagon war plans for decades, and recent developments suggest that doctrine might be closer to implementation than anyone outside classified briefings realizes. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are covering the strategic realities that mainstream coverage either misses or deliberately ignores. Today's topic is not about Iranian speedboats or missile threats. It is about why the United States maintains the capability and potentially the intention to do exactly what it accuses adversaries of threatening. I'm going to show you exactly how American naval doctrine envisions controlling the Strait of Hormuz, not by keeping it open, but by closing it. We will cover the specific capabilities that make this possible, the strategic scenarios that might trigger such a decision, and the second-order economic and geopolitical consequences that would reshape global power dynamics overnight. By the end, you will understand why the greatest threat to Persian Gulf energy flows might not come from Tehran's threats, but from Washington's contingency plans. To understand why the United States would ever consider closing the Strait of Hormuz, you need to grasp what this waterway actually represents in strategic terms. The strait is an 18-mile-wide choke point at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, separating Iran from Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Through this narrow passage flows approximately 21 million barrels of oil per day, representing roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption. That number understates the strategic significance, because the strait carries about 30% of all seaborne traded oil and a significant portion of liquefied natural gas exports from Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter. The geography is deceptively simple. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes through the strait are only 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. The depth reaches 300 feet in the main channel but varies considerably, creating navigational constraints that force predictable shipping routes. Any vessel transiting the strait must pass through waters where Iran can observe from positions along its southern coast, and where mines, missiles, or naval forces could interdict traffic with relatively modest military capabilities. For decades, Iran has threatened to close the strait in response to sanctions, military pressure, or regional conflicts. These threats have become so routine that markets barely react anymore. Tehran has conducted military exercises demonstrating its ability to lay mines, swarm attacking with small boats, and fire anti-ship cruise missiles at tankers. Western analysts have spent countless hours modeling Iranian closure scenarios, calculating how long it would take to reopen the waterway, and estimating global economic impact. But here is what almost nobody discusses publicly. The United States Navy does not just plan for defending against Iranian closure of the strait. It maintains detailed operational plans for closing the strait itself under specific strategic circumstances. This is not conspiracy theory. It is documented military doctrine rooted in sea control principles that have governed naval warfare for centuries. The nation that controls a choke point controls everything that passes through it, including the decision of whether anything passes through it at all. The strategic logic becomes clear when you examine potential conflict scenarios that extend beyond limited regional disputes. Consider a situation where the United States faces simultaneous great power conflict across multiple theaters. China moves against Taiwan. Russia escalates in Eastern Europe. Iran, seeing an opportunity, surges military support to proxies across the Middle East and threatens American interests throughout the Persian Gulf region. In that scenario, the United States faces a critical resource allocation problem. American naval forces are finite. Carrier strike groups, amphibious ready groups, and submarine assets must be distributed across Pacific, Atlantic, and European theaters based on priority. The Persian Gulf, while strategically significant, becomes a secondary theater in a great power conflict scenario. But the Gulf contains assets that could dramatically complicate American strategic calculations if they remain available to adversaries. Specifically, the oil revenues flowing through the Strait of Hormuz potentially fund continued Iranian military operations, support proxies engaging American forces or allies, and provide economic lifeline to regimes whose collapse would benefit American strategic objectives. Closing the strait solves multiple problems simultaneously from a cold strategic perspective. It denies Iran the ability to export oil and therefore the revenues that fund its military and proxy networks. It prevents Chinese access to Persian Gulf energy supplies that Beijing desperately needs to sustain its economy and military operations in a protracted conflict. It creates massive economic pressure on adversaries while allowing the United States to manage its own energy security through domestic production, Canadian imports, and Western Hemisphere reserves that do not require strait transit. The capabilities required to close the strait are not exotic or theoretical. They exist in the current United States naval arsenal and have existed in various forms for decades. The most straightforward method involves mining operations. The United States Navy maintains stockpiles of various mine types, including the Mk-67 submarine-launched mobile mine and the Quick Strike series of aircraft-delivered mines. A single submarine could lay dozens of mines across the Strait's shipping channels in a matter of hours. Aircraft operating from regional bases or carrier strike groups could deliver hundreds more. The mines need not actually sink ships to achieve closure. The mere presence of a minefield, confirmed by one or two detonations, effectively closes the waterway to commercial traffic. Insurance rates for tankers attempting transit would become prohibitive. Shipping companies would refuse to risk vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars, plus cargo valued even higher. The strait would be closed not by physical barrier, but by economic calculation. Mine countermeasures take time. Even with advanced systems, clearing a professionally laid minefield requires slow, methodical work by specialized vessels. The United States Navy operates the world's most capable mine countermeasures forces, but clearing its own mines from the strait could take weeks or months, depending on the extent and sophistication of the minefield. During that period, zero commercial traffic flows. Zero oil exports leave the Persian Gulf. The global economy faces energy shock unlike anything seen since the 1970s oil embargoes. Beyond mining, the United States maintains cruise missile capabilities that could disable port facilities throughout the Persian Gulf. Iran's Karg Island terminal handles the majority of Iranian oil exports. Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura complex is the world's largest offshore oil loading facility. The UAE's Jebel Ali port serves as critical transshipment hub. Precision strikes using Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from submarines or surface vessels could render these facilities inoperable without even touching the strait itself. No loading facilities means no exports regardless of whether the waterway remains technically navigable. The strategic calculation becomes even more interesting when you consider targeting doctrine. The United States does not need to permanently destroy these facilities. Temporary disruption achieves the strategic objective while preserving the option to restart flows under different political conditions. A Tomahawk strike that damages loading equipment or control systems creates weeks or months of downtime, but allows eventual repair and resumption of operations when strategic circumstances change. Naval blockade represents another closure mechanism. The United States Navy could enforce a quarantine of the strait, stopping and inspecting all vessels, allowing only those meeting specific criteria to transit. This approach offers more flexibility than mining, permitting selective access while denying it to adversaries. But it also requires sustained naval presence and creates potential for escalation with neutral nations whose vessels face interdiction. Think about what that means for a moment. In a great power conflict scenario, the United States could effectively weaponize global energy markets by controlling access to Persian Gulf supplies. Allies and neutral nations dependent on Gulf oil would face a choice: align with American strategic objectives and potentially maintain energy access, or maintain relationships with adversaries and face energy starvation. Now here is where it gets genuinely interesting. The United States has spent the past 15 years systematically reducing its own vulnerability to Persian Gulf supply disruptions. American domestic oil production reached 3 million barrels per day in 2023, making the United States the world's largest oil producer. The fracking revolution created energy independence that previous generations could not have imagined. American imports from the Persian Gulf have dropped to negligible levels. The United States no longer needs the Strait of Hormuz to remain open for its own energy security. Compare that to China's position. Beijing imports approximately 10 million barrels of oil per day, with roughly 40% originating from Persian Gulf producers and transiting the strait. China has attempted to diversify supply through pipelines from Russia and Central Asia, but these cannot replace Gulf volumes. A strait closure would create immediate energy crisis in China, forcing difficult decisions about strategic petroleum reserve drawdowns, economic activity reductions, and military operations sustainability. Europe's position is only marginally better. While European nations have diversified away from Persian Gulf supplies more than China, significant volumes still flow from the region. A protracted strait closure would spike global oil prices even for supplies originating elsewhere, as markets respond to reduced total availability. European economies would face severe stress, potentially fracturing alliance cohesion if some nations perceived American closure of the strait as sacrificing European interests for American strategic objectives. This is where the second-order effects become genuinely significant. A United States decision to close the Strait of Hormuz would represent strategic shift from maintaining freedom of navigation to actively restricting it. This reverses decades of American naval doctrine and diplomatic positioning. The United States has consistently argued that international waterways must remain open, that freedom of navigation is foundational principle of international order, and that any nation threatening to close critical choke points undermines global security. If the United States closes the strait, even in context of great power conflict, it validates the principle that controlling powers can restrict access through strategic waterways. That precedent has profound implications for other choke points. Could Turkey legitimately close the Turkish Straits in future conflicts? Could Egypt restrict Suez Canal access based on political alignment? Could Indonesia regulate Malacca Strait transit beyond current arrangements? The legal framework around such actions is genuinely complex. The Strait of Hormuz is classified as a strait used for international navigation, which under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea grants right of transit passage to all vessels. Closing the strait would violate international law under normal circumstances. But laws of armed conflict create different standards. A nation engaged in war possesses belligerent rights, including establishment of exclusion zones and interdiction of neutral shipping under certain conditions. The United States would argue that closure constitutes legitimate military necessity in context of great power conflict. Adversaries and neutral nations would dispute this interpretation, but international legal mechanisms for resolving such disputes become meaningless during actual great power war. The International Court of Justice cannot compel compliance when nuclear-armed nations make strategic decisions they deem essential to survival. Economic modeling of a strait closure scenario produces genuinely alarming projections. Oil prices would spike immediately to levels potentially exceeding $200 per barrel in initial panic. Even as strategic petroleum reserves get released and alternative supplies rerouted, sustained prices above $150 per barrel seem likely for months. Global GDP would contract by estimated 2 to 4%, triggering recession across most economies. But these economic costs are not evenly distributed. The United States, with domestic energy production and Western Hemisphere supply access, would experience significant but manageable economic stress. China, Japan, South Korea, and India would face economic catastrophe. European nations would fall somewhere in between depending on their specific energy profiles and reserve positions. From a cold strategic perspective, asymmetric economic pain serves American interests in a great power conflict. If the United States can sustain its economy and military operations, while adversaries face energy starvation and economic collapse, the calculus of protracted conflict shifts decisively in American favor. This is economic warfare at unprecedented scale, leveraging geographic advantages and military capabilities to reshape global resource access. There are significant limitations and risks to this strategy that demand acknowledgement. First, closure duration matters enormously. A few weeks of strait closure might be strategically sustainable. Months of closure could fracture alliances as even friendly nations face unbearable economic costs. Years of closure would fundamentally reshape global economic geography in ways that might not favor long-term American interests. Second, the precedent issue cuts both ways. If the United States establishes that great powers can close international waterways during conflicts, China gains justification for future actions in the South China Sea or around Taiwan. Russia could cite American precedent for actions in the Black Sea or Arctic passages. The international order that has generally served American interests since 1945 would sustain severe damage. Third, this assumes that closing the strait actually achieves desired strategic effects without unacceptable escalation. But desperate nations make desperate decisions. If China faces economic collapse due to energy starvation, Beijing might escalate to nuclear threshold rather than accept defeat. The same logic applies to other adversaries facing existential economic pressure. Fourth, neutral nations, particularly India, would face impossible choices. India depends heavily on Persian Gulf energy, but maintains strategic autonomy. A United States closure of the strait that threatens Indian energy security could push New Delhi toward positions that complicate American strategic objectives. Managing alliance politics during a strait closure would require extraordinary diplomatic skill alongside military capability. Alternative perspectives deserve consideration. Some strategists argue that closing the strait would be strategic blunder because it surrenders the moral high ground that American foreign policy depends on. The United States positions itself as defender of international order and freedom of navigation. Becoming the power that closes critical waterways undermines that positioning and hands adversaries powerful propaganda weapon. Others contend that economic interdependence cuts both ways. While strait closure might harm adversaries more than the United States, it also damages global economy in ways that reduce American power over time. The dollar's status as global reserve currency, American corporate access to global markets, and the international financial architecture that amplifies American power all depend on functioning global economy. Deliberately triggering global recession might win tactical advantage while eroding strategic foundations of American primacy. There is also genuine question about whether the political leadership would actually authorize such action. Closing the Strait of Hormuz would represent decision of historic magnitude, with consequences extending decades beyond any immediate conflict. The domestic political costs within the United States could be severe as gasoline prices spike and 401k accounts collapse in market panic. The president ordering such action would face intense pressure unless the great power conflict context made the necessity undeniable. What remains uncertain is the threshold. At what point does strategic calculus shift toward viewing strait closure as necessary rather than option of last resort? The answer depends on factors that cannot be predicted with confidence, including severity of simultaneous threats, availability of alternatives, and assessment of adversary resolve. So what has fundamentally changed? The United States has achieved energy independence that makes strait closure strategically thinkable in ways it was not during previous decades when American economy depended on Gulf oil flows. Naval capabilities for implementing closure have been refined and maintained. Doctrine has been developed in classified planning processes. The pieces are in place. Only the trigger is missing. The broader implication extends beyond any specific conflict scenario. The nation that can close the Strait of Hormuz is the nation that truly controls it, regardless of whose coastline borders the waterway. Iran has threatened closure for decades but lacks ability to sustain such action against American military response. The United States rarely discusses closure, but maintains unmatched capability to implement and sustain it indefinitely. This reveals fundamental truth about maritime chokepoints in an era of great power competition. Control is not determined by geography or legal frameworks. Control is determined by military capability and willingness to use it. The Strait of Hormuz flows with oil because the United States Navy allows it to flow. That permission could be revoked under circumstances that might be closer than comfortable to contemplate. What should we watch for next? The key indicators would be shifts in strategic petroleum reserve policy, changes in naval force posture around the Persian Gulf, and evolution of operational plans that Pentagon officials occasionally reference in congressional testimony. Any movement suggesting the United States is positioning for extended operations without Gulf energy access would signal that closure options are moving from theoretical to operational planning. The ultimate irony is that the greatest threat to Persian Gulf energy flows comes not from the regional powers that depend on those flows for survival, but from the distant power that no longer needs them. Iran cannot afford to close the strait because doing so destroys its own economy. Saudi Arabia and UAE cannot close it without committing economic suicide. But the United States could close it, sustain closure, and potentially benefit strategically from the asymmetric consequences. That capability defines control in its purest form. Not the ability to keep something open, but the power to close it at will. The Strait of Hormuz remains open today not because Iran lacks the capability to threaten it, but because the United States has not yet decided that its interests are better served by closure than by flow. If this analysis helped you understand the strategic realities that mainstream coverage ignores, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are covering the naval capabilities and doctrines that actually determine outcomes when great power competition turns kinetic. The economic weapons matter as much as the kinetic ones, and nobody else is connecting these dots.